In tonight's news edition, Jordan condemns the terrorist attack against restaurants in the Somali capital Mogadishu that claims the lives of at least 20 people. Tunisia declares a nationwide curfew after 4 days of protests and rioting over jobs and economic conditions. And U.S. Secretary of State joins world leaders in Davos, where he makes an appeal to boost funding for the UN to deal with the global refugee crisis. Good evening and welcome to the news at 10. His Majesty the King made a telephone call to the Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi to discuss the Syrian refugees' burden on host countries. During the telephone conversation, the King and the Italian Prime Minister underlined the importance of the international community's support to Syrian refugee host countries, mainly Jordan, to help them shoulder this burden. The King noted the importance of the upcoming refugee conference slated to be held in the United Kingdom early next month to discuss the repercussions of the Syrian refugee crisis. The King and the Italian Prime Minister also reviewed efforts to fight terrorism through a holistic approach and voiced their keenness to boost cooperation to counter terrorism. The Italian Premier reiterated his country's support to the kingdom in its efforts to address the ramifications of the Syrian refugees. Jordan condemned the terrorist attack against restaurants in the Somali capital Mogadishu that claimed the lives of at least 20 people. Minister of State for Media Affairs Mohammed Al-Momani reiterated Jordan's condemnation of such terrorist acts that terrorize innocent people and affirmed the objectives of terrorist groups to wreak havoc in all countries. He said such acts require united international efforts to confront such terrorist organizations and affirmed Jordan's support to Somalia in its effort to fight terrorism. At least 20 people were killed in the Somali capital of Mogadishu when 5 terrorist gunmen set off bombs and stormed a popular beachfront restaurant. Somalia's Security Minister Abdulrazak Omar Mohammed said 4 of the gunmen were killed and 1 was captured alive. Here's more.
Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta visits soldiers injured in an attack last week by al-Shabaab militants on a Kenyan army base in neighboring Somalia. But just hours before he arrived, there'd been another deadly attack, this time in Somalia's capital Mogadishu, at a restaurant on the popular Lido beach. The late-night car bombing and gun battle that followed left at least 17 people dead. In Nairobi, Kenyatta told a service for last week's victims that his government is determined to destroy al-Shabaab.
Every Kenyan must understand that this is a war that requires that we all be united as a nation and that we stand shoulder to shoulder to face the enemy of humanity.
But images of coffins carrying soldiers has eaten away at some of that resolve in Kenya. Kenya's main opposition is calling for the withdrawal of its troops from Somalia, even as Kenyatta vows to stay on course.
The January 22nd internationally brokered peace talks on the Syria crisis between the government and the opposition could begin on January 27th. But the Saudi-backed Syrian opposition ruled out even indirect negotiations with Damascus unless certain steps are taken, which include a halt to Russian airstrikes. A senior opposition official said the obstacles to the talks were still there, reiterating demands for the lifting of blockades on populated areas and the release of detainees. However, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry insisted that talks will begin next week. The Syrian government, for its side, said it is ready to take part in the Geneva talks on time. Meanwhile, on the ground, at least 30 people were killed in air raids carried out by either Russian or Syrian warplanes near the city of Deir ez-Zor in eastern Syria. The British-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said the strikes hit the town of Tabiyat Jazira, adding that the dead included more than a dozen children. Russian jets have been bombing around Deir ez-Zor as Syrian pro-government forces clash with Daesh terrorists who control most of the province. The United States and its allies conducted 19 strikes against Daesh terrorists, including 2 in Syria and 17 in Iraq. The combined joint task force said in a statement, the airstrikes in Syria hit Daesh gas plant and a tactical unit. In Iraq, 6 strikes in Mosul hit a bridge and 2 tactical units and destroyed 3 fighting positions. 6 additional strikes in Ramadi destroyed vehicles, explosives, and a weapon cache, among other targets, while 5 strikes in 4 other cities struck tactical units and damaged buildings. Daesh-affiliated Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis claimed responsibility for an explosion in Cairo's Haram area that killed 10 people. A statement from the Ministry of Interior said the explosion killed 7 policemen and 3 civilians. According to state-owned Al-Haram, the bomb exploded during a police raid on an apartment in the area where militants were suspected of hiding. Tunisia declared a nationwide curfew after 4 days of protests and rioting over jobs and economic conditions, the worst unrest since an uprising 5 years ago. There were further demonstrations in several regions, including Qasrain and Sidi Bouzid. A security official said at least 19 people were arrested in the Tunisian capital in connection with the unrest. The Interior Ministry said in a statement that due to the risk to public and private property from the protest, it was imposing a curfew from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. effective immediately. The protest started in the impoverished central town of Qasrain after a young man who was apparently being refused a public sector job killed himself. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry joined world leaders in Davos, where he will make an appeal to boost funding for the UN to deal with the global refugee crisis. Kerry was seeking to encourage a boost in UN humanitarian funding this year to $13 billion to deal with the global refugee crisis at a summit to be hosted by U.S. President Barack Obama in September on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. He said it would also seek to increase the number of regular humanitarian donor countries and those admitting refugees by 10, and to get 1 million refugee children into schools and 1 million refugees legally.
And in response to the global refugee crisis, President Obama is going to host a summit at the UN this fall, and the summit will be the culmination of a sustained, rigorous effort to rally the world community on several fronts to increase by 30% the response to humanitarian funding appeals, the number of regular humanitarian donors, to increase it by at least 10, to at least double the number of refugees who are resettled or afforded other safe and legal channels of admission, to expand by 10 the total number of countries admitting refugees, and to get 1 million children in school and 1 million people working legally.
Separately in Davos, Iraq's Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi called on Turkey to help fight against Daesh.
We in Iraq want very good neighborly relationship with Turkey. We hope Turkey will help us to fight Daesh. Daesh is killing our own citizens, occupying our own cities. We have 4 million internal refugees because of that. And Turkey should help us. And I appeal for Turkish government to help us and to grow their forces.
A massive storm barreled towards Washington, D.C., poised to drop near-record snowfall on the U.S. Capitol before hitting New York and other East Coast cities with blizzard conditions. The National Weather Service described the storm as potentially crippling for large parts of the Northeast, with snowfall exceeding 61 centimeters in the Baltimore and Washington metro areas. In Virginia, a state of emergency was declared ahead of the storm. The Virginia National Guard said it planned to bring in up to 300 troops to assist in response operations. Serena Williams sent a warning to the rest of the field that she was still working towards an A game as she charged into the Australian Open 4th round with a 6-1, 6-1 demolition of Russian teenager Daria Kostenkinka playing a record 8th main draw match at Belbourne Park against an 18-year-old on her first trip down under. The American champion was merciless, blasting 24 winners and winning all 10 points. Meanwhile, Novak Djokovic continued his path to a potential Australian Open semi-final showdown with Roger Federer with a 6-1, 7-5, 7-6 third-rounder victory over Italy's Andrea Seppi. And finally, cold weather continues in most regions for the rest of the night, with some clouds and northwesterly moderate winds. Freezing is also in the forecast after midnight in the Badia and southern hilly areas. Tomorrow, the kingdom will be affected by a low depression centered over Cyprus that is expected to bring lower temperatures and rain in the northern regions that will gradually extend to other parts of the kingdom. The Gulf of Aqaba should expect relatively cold and partly cloudy conditions tomorrow, with northerly moderate to brisk winds and slightly high seas. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. To end the news, here's a reminder of our top stories. Jordan condemns the terrorist attack against a restaurant in the Somali capital, Mogadishu, that claims the lives of at least 20 people. Tunisia declares a nationwide curfew after 4 days of protest and rioting over jobs and economic conditions. And U.S. Secretary of State joins world leaders in Davos, where he makes an appeal to boost funding for the UN to deal with the global refugee crisis. With that, we come to the end of tonight's news. I'm Nancy Khair. Thank you for watching and have a good night.